So imagine this. It's 1757, and a corporate middle manager basically goes completely rogue while his boss is temporarily away from the battlefield. And somehow, by doing this, he accidentally conquers an entire subcontinent for an accounting firm.
Right. I mean, it sounds exactly like the pitch for some absurd historical comedy, but it's actually the documented reality of how one of the largest empires in human history got its start.
Yeah, it's wild. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are taking a look at this massive historical paradox today. Basically, how does a modest trading corporation, one that is completely obsessed with shipping routes and quarterly profit margins, inadvertently become the British Raj?
Exactly. And our guide for this today is this incredibly detailed historical introduction. It was written in 1917 by W.K. Firminger for a massive parliamentary text called the 1812 Fifth Report from the Select Committee of the House of Commons on the Affairs of the East India Company.
Rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah, it's mouthful. But just to set the parameters for you as we dive into this material, we are analyzing this 1917 document strictly from the perspective of the British Colonial Archives.
Which is important to note.
Definitely. Our goal here isn't to, validate or endorse the imperialism of the era. That is obviously a highly charged, very heavy subject.
Yeah, we're not taking sides here.
Exactly. We're simply trying to decode the actual literal mechanics of how this corporate takeover happened, just according to their own internal records and their own parliamentary investigations.
Right. We are looking at the company's own ledgers and their own internal legal debates. And the core theme we are exploring today completely shatters the traditional history book narrative that you were probably taught in school.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we are taught that empires are built by, grand military design and deliberate conquest. But this text reveals that the British Empire in India was primarily built through bureaucratic mission creep and just a frantic obsession with tax collection, plus this elaborate, sort of bizarre masked system where a massive multinational corporation essentially pretended not to be a government for decades.
The sheer scale of the administrative improvisation is just staggering. I mean, to understand the mechanics of how a company accidentally becomes a sovereign state, we really have to deconstruct the most famous starting point of British rule in India.
Which is the Battle of Plassey, right, in 1757.
Exactly. Plassey is perhaps the most widely misunderstood event in this whole timeline.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the standard textbook story you always hear is all about Lord Robert Clive.
Right, Clive of India.
Yeah, he's always painted as this military genius who executed a brilliant tactical masterstroke that just secured Bengal for England. I mean, he even gets named Baron Clive of Plassey.
He does, yeah. And the legend of Plassey is foundational to the myth of the British Empire. But Firminger's text just strips that myth completely down to the studs.
How?
Well, when you examine the actual historical records, the victory at Plassey had remarkably little to do with military tactics or British bravery.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it was almost entirely the result of backdoor corporate espionage and just blatant treason.
Oh, wow. So the text highlights this East India Company agent named Watts, right, who was basically running this massive bribery and intrigue campaign behind the scenes.
Yes, exactly. Watts is the real architect here. He managed to secure these secret deals with the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah's most powerful generals, specifically men like Mir Jafar and Reid-ur-Lamp.
Okay.
So on the actual day of the battle, the Nawab's forces had formed this massive, imposing crescent of cavalry that completely outflanked the tiny English force. Tactically speaking, the English were completely trapped.
They were sitting ducks.
Exactly. If those generals had simply given the order to charge, the East India Company's army would have been wiped off the map, completely annihilated. But because of Watts's secret negotiations, those generals just held their troops back.
They just didn't fight.
They literally stood in the rain and watched.
That is insane. And here's where it gets really interesting to me, because the actual decisive military strike wasn't even Clive's idea. The text shows that Clive, the supposed mastermind, didn't even order the attack.
No, he didn't.
He was actually absent from the field at the critical moment.
Right, he had retreated to a nearby hunting lodge, basically to change his wet clothes and deliberate on the next move. His predetermined plan was strictly to just hold his ground, survive the day, and maybe, if they were lucky, attempt a night assault.
But while he's away changing his shirt, this officer named Kilpatrick just decides to go rogue.
Yep.
He sees this momentary vulnerability in the enemy lines and just orders a gallant rush across the muddy swamps. And it was completely unauthorized, directly contrary to Clive's explicit orders.
But once Kilpatrick's men started charging, They couldn't exactly be called back.
Right.
And that unauthorized chaotic rush threw the Nawab's remaining loyal forces into disarray. It ultimately triggered the collapse of the opposing army.
And Clive's reaction.
Oh, Clive returns to the field, absolutely furious that his orders were disobeyed. But, he has no choice but to take command of the charge that is already in the process of winning the battle.
It's just the ultimate corporate scenario. I mean, Lord Clive is like a modern CEO who gets his face on the cover of Forbes magazine and takes home a $50 million bonus, all because some middle manager made a wildly unauthorized high-risk gamble while the CEO is out grabbing coffee.
That is a perfect analogy.
And because it paid off, the CEO writes the history book saying it was his grand strategy all along.
The analogy is incredibly fitting, especially when you look at how the real bosses back in London reacted to all
You'd
this.
assume they'd be thrilled, right?
You might assume that. The East India Company's court of directors, the shareholders and executives actually running the business, you'd think they would be ecstatic. Their agents just effectively took control of Bengal, which was one of the wealthiest provinces in the world at the time.
Right, you'd think they would be popping champagne in London.
But the reality is they were absolutely terrified.
Terrified. Why?
Well, the source text includes these letters from the court of directors where they are constantly scolding their agents in India for getting involved in local politics. Decades earlier, in 1721, they wrote a directive explicitly stating, quote, "Remember, we are not fond of much territory."
Wow, they actually put that in writing.
Yes, and they follow that up in other dispatches, insisting that our business is trade. They felt it was simply not profitable for them to be encumbered with military outposts and local governance.
Well, sure, because ruling a country ruins the profit margins. You have to pay for standing armies, you have to build infrastructure, you have to run courts.
Exactly.
They were a business. They just wanted to buy cheap textiles and spices and sell them high in Europe.
That overhead is exactly what they feared. And to understand just how deeply ingrained this anti-conquest mindset was, the text takes us back to 1717, to this massive diplomatic effort known as the Sermon Embassy.
Right.
This provides a really crucial baseline for the company's original attitude.
This is John Sermon's mission to the Mughal Emperor Farrukshah. This part of the text is fascinating because it shows how incredibly subservient the company was before Plassey.
Completely subservient.
They send this insanely expensive diplomatic mission laden with all these gifts, and they literally sit at the Mughal court for years. They are essentially begging, using endless patience and bribery, just to secure the revenue rights for a mere 38 villages near Calcutta.
38 villages. That's it. And they wanted those 38 villages purely as a buffer zone.
Just to protect their warehouses.
Exactly, to protect their warehouses from local bandits and arbitrary tolls. They were acting as humble petitioners, fully acknowledging the absolute supremacy of the Mughal emperor. So the leap from begging for 38 villages in 1717 to accidentally conquering a province in 1757, it was a logistical nightmare for the bean counters in London.
So if London didn't want the territory and they were terrified of the administrative expenses, how does the East India Company actually end up ruling Bengal? Because they don't just pack up and leave after Plassey, obviously.
No, they don't, because a power vacuum is terrible for business. If they just leave, the French might swoop in and take over. Or a new hostile Nawab might just confiscate all their goods.
You're stuck.
Yeah, so they adopt this strategy of desperate pragmatism. They realize the only way to genuinely secure their trade routes is to control the local tax collection, because the tax collection pays for the local troops, and those troops protect their factories.
But they don't just run up the British flag and declare themselves kings. They implement what the text calls the masked system.
Yes, the masked system. What's fascinating here is that this is perhaps the most bizarre administrative fiction in imperial history.
It really is.
After Plassey, rather than declaring themselves sovereign rulers, the East India Company opted to operate as a zamindar, basically a local landholder and tax collector, under the official nominal authority of the Mughal emperor.
Even though they had all the real power.
Right. And even later, in 1765, when they acquired the Diwani, which is the grand official right to collect all the revenues for the vast provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, they still kept the mask on.
So on paper, they are pretending to just be these humble civil servants administering the tax code for the native government.
Yes, the sheer mechanics of the deception are incredible. On the ground, this meant the East India Company physically held the military power. They guarded the treasuries. But the tax receipts were written in Persian, in the name of the Mughal emperor.
That is so strange.
The local criminal courts were still run by Indian judges, applying Islamic law. The company used local native officials to actually go out and collect the taxes from the farmers, so the local population rarely even saw a British face demanding money.
Wait, hold on. I have to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
You're telling me the company has the actual army. They are physically guarding the tax money and locking it in their own company vaults. But they leave a local ruler, the Nawab, sitting in a palace on a generous pension just for show.
Just for show.
How long can you realistically fake being an employee when you literally own the building, write the paychecks, and command the security guards? I mean, who is buying that?
It sounds impossible to sustain, right? And it was. But Firminger's text outlines 3 very specific reasons why they maintained this charade for as long as they did. First, they didn't want to trigger a massive coalition of native Indian powers against them.
Okay, that makes sense.
If they suddenly declared themselves a foreign conquering empire, the Marathas and other powerful states would have united and probably crushed them.
Right, so it's a defensive measure.
Exactly. Second is international diplomacy. They needed to keep their European rivals, particularly the French and the Dutch, from objecting.
Ah.
If the British Crown officially claimed sovereign territory in India, it could easily spark a global war. But if the East India Company was just acting as a private tax collector hired by the local Nawab, well, the French couldn't really complain without insulting the Nawab.
That's a very clever loophole.
And third, as we discussed, they had to appease the shareholders back in London. Those investors demanded steady dividends, not the incredibly expensive glory of a political empire.
So it's basically a massive multi-layered shell corporation.
Exactly.
But clearly, the mask has to slip eventually. And reading the source text, it seems like the main reason it finally collapses isn't because of a war, but because the native tax system they inherited to run this shell game was completely broken.
Oh, absolutely. The internal decay of the system is what ultimately forces the issue. The company thought they were acquiring the keys to a well-oiled financial machine, but instead, they inherited an absolute bureaucratic nightmare.
Right.
To understand the scale of the dysfunction, the text contrasts the 18th century reality with the golden era of the Mughal Empire under Emperor Akbar back in the late 16th century.
Right. The text talks a lot about Akbar and his finance minister, Todar Mal. They had built this incredible, highly detailed revenue assessment system called the Tumarjuma.
Yes, the Tumarjuma was a marvel of pre-modern administration. It wasn't just some blind demand for cash from the peasants. Todar Mal instituted actual physical measurements of the land. They used standardized bamboo poles linked with iron rings.
Very precise.
Highly precise. They assessed the soil fertility, they calculated average crop yields over a 10-year period, and then they converted that agricultural data into a fixed, equitable cash tax.
That was fair.
It was a massive data collection project meant to protect the cultivator from extortion while reliably funding the state.
But by the time the British accountants show up in the 1700s, just after Plassey, the ghost of Akbar's perfect system is long gone.
Long gone.
The text describes the late Mughal administration as a broken-down, terror-stricken system. So if the Tumarjuma is completely gone, how are the local strongmen actually getting the money?
Through arbitrary exactions and the constant threat of military force. As the central Mughal authority weakened over the decades, the regional Nawabs stopped relying on those careful land surveys. They just started demanding arbitrary lump sums from the local zamindars.
The tax collectors.
Right, and if a zamindar couldn't pay the lump sum, he was imprisoned or tortured. So the zamindars simply passed the violence downward. They squeezed the peasant cultivators for every last grain of rice just to meet the quota and keep their own heads.
So what does this all mean for the British? I mean, if the native system is falling apart into just chaos and violence, how does a British clerk sitting in a Calcutta office figure out who actually owns the land and who owes what?
They couldn't. It was chaos.
The text mentions this massive ideological fight over this exact problem between two of the most powerful British officials in India, Philip Francis and the Governor-General, Warren Hastings. What were they actually arguing about?
So they were arguing about the fundamental nature of property in India. Philip Francis looked at these zamindars, the guys collecting the taxes, and he mistakenly applied a very European lens to them.
Okay.
Francis believed the zamindars were the ancient, absolute proprietors of the soil. He basically saw them as the Indian equivalent of English feudal lords.
He thought he was looking at the Duke of Cornwall or something.
Precisely. And because Francis thought they were the absolute owners of the land by ancient right, he argued the company should lock in a permanent moderate tax rate with these zamindars. He thought that would stabilize the economy and protect their supposed property rights.
But Warren Hastings pushes back hard against this idea.
Very hard. Hastings had actually been in the weeds of the administration for years. He spoke the local languages. He read the local Persian documents.
He knew what was actually going on.
Exactly. Hastings realized that Francis's European feudal theory was a complete fantasy. Hastings argued that the zamindars were not ancient lords at all. They were essentially just glorified tax farmers.
Bureaucrats.
Yes, they were government bureaucrats whose estates were often just administrative jurisdictions granted by the state.
Yeah.
And those grants could be revoked at any time.
And Hastings actually brings receipts for this, right? The text mentions the massive Rajshahi estate of Rani Pawani. Francis looks at it and sees this ancient ancestral kingdom. But Hastings points out that this massive estate was basically just cobbled together over the last century by a favorite official of a recent Nawab.
Yes, the Rajshahi estate was an administrative consolidation. It was not a bloodline inheritance. Hastings understood that in the Indian system, the state was the ultimate owner of the revenue, and the zamindar was just a commissioned agent.
It really seems like Philip Francis was essentially trying to run a rigid European feudalism software update on an Indian operating system that was 400 years old, highly fluid, and currently completely riddled with malware.
That is a brilliant way to look at it.
It's no wonder it crashed.
And Warren Hastings is the guy looking at the source code, realizing the entire native administration is just too corrupted to patch. This ideological confusion, combined with a catastrophic drop in revenue collections, finally forces Hastings to abandon the shell game entirely. In 1772, he makes the momentous decision that the East India Company must, quote, stand forth as Diwan.
They dropped the act.
They drop the act. They take direct, visible control of the revenue collection and the administration of civil justice. British supervisors, who were eventually organized into provincial councils and a centralized board of revenue, take over the ledger books.
They stop hiding behind the local native officials.
Exactly.
But doing that triggers a massive legal earthquake.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if the company is openly collecting all the taxes and running the financial boards and administering the courts, who is actually the sovereign ruler of Bengal? Is it the British Crown back in London? Is it the corporate directors of the East India Company? Or is it still the local Nawab sitting in his palace?
Right. That ambiguity is exactly what brings the entire mask system to its final dramatic collapse. As Hastings centralized the administration, the illusion of the Nawab's power completely vanished.
Because he didn't actually have any power left?
None. The company even reduced and then effectively stopped paying the Nawab his customary tribute. The Nawab was literally left with a palace and an empty title.
Which sets up this incredible showdown in 1775. This is the trial of a man named Roy Radha Churn, and it plays out like a high-stakes courtroom drama.
It is the defining legal test of the era. So, Roy Radha Churn is put on trial in the newly established British Supreme Court in Calcutta for conspiracy against Warren Hastings himself.
And Philip Francis, who, it should be noted, absolutely despises Hastings, sees an opportunity here.
A huge opportunity.
Francis tries to protect Roy Radha Churn from prosecution by arguing a point of international law. Francis claims that the court can't touch Churn because he is an ambassador of the Nawab of Bengal.
Right.
And as an ambassador of a sovereign ruler, he possesses full diplomatic immunity.
It was a brilliant, highly politicized legal maneuver by Francis. He is essentially trying to force the British legal system to formally recognize the Nawab as a true independent sovereign.
Because if he is, then Hastings is just an employee again.
Exactly. If the court agrees that the Nawab is a sovereign, then his ambassador has immunity, and Hastings' entire attempt to centralize power is legally blocked.
But the Supreme Court judges are having absolutely none of it. They look at the reality on the ground, and the legal smackdown they deliver is just legendary. The text quotes the judges directly, and they systematically destroy the illusion of the mask system right there on the public record.
The ruling from the bench is devastating. Puisne Justice Lemestre delivers the fatal blow to the facade.
What does he say?
He examines the real power dynamic and explicitly calls the Nawab a phantom and a man of straw.
Wow.
He states that treating this Nawab as a sovereign prince, capable of sending ambassadors, is, quote, an insult to the understanding of the court.
He literally says he has too much respect for that body to treat it ludicrously. It's just a brutal, undeniable legal teardown of everything the East India Company had been pretending for 20 years.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that specific trial in 1775 is the exact moment the East India Company is forced to legally look in the mirror. They have to admit, under oath in a court of law, that they are not just spice traders anymore.
Right.
They are not humble tax collectors acting on behalf of a distant Mughal emperor. The mask is officially off. They are the absolute military, financial, and political rulers of Bengal.
The corporate buyout of a country is complete. And it wasn't achieved by a conquering army planting a flag on a hill. It was finalized by a panel of judges looking at a ledger and saying, come on, we all know who's really writing the checks here.
The trial of Roy Radha Churn was merely the legal acknowledgement of a stark administrative reality. Step by step, the native military supremacy was neutralized by rogue officers at Plassey, the revenues were monopolized to pay for company troops, and the actual day-to-day governance was usurped by corporate managers who were just trying to hit their revenue targets.
It really changes how you visualize the map of history. From day one, we are conditioned to believe that empires are forged by brilliant strategists drawing lines in the sand, by kings and queens executing these grand visions.
Right, the grand narrative.
But this deep dive proves something entirely different, and frankly, a bit unsettling. The British Empire in India, the so-called jewel in the crown, was largely built by accountants, by mid-level tax collectors, and by corporate middle managers who accidentally conquered a nation while they were just trying to balance a spreadsheet and protect their supply chains.
It is a profound historical lesson about the true nature of power. It shows us that power doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and declarations of war. Sometimes it creeps in quietly through the bureaucratic back door.
Yeah.
And this raises an important question, one that I think is incredibly relevant for you to mull over today. If you look at the landscape of our own era, consider the massive multinational corporations operating right now.
You mean the massive tech giants and financial conglomerates?
Exactly. These modern entities control global data, massive communication networks, and critical digital infrastructure.
Their annual revenues dwarf the GDPs of many developing nations.
They do. They operate across borders, often entirely beyond the reach or even the full technical understanding of traditional governments.
They practically have their own foreign policies and arbitration courts.
So the provocative thought this 1917 text leaves us with is this. At what point does a modern corporation's invisible structural influence over our data and our infrastructure turn them into a phantom sovereign in our own time? The history of the East India Company proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that a corporation absolutely does not need to formally declare itself a government to eventually become one.
Wow. From patiently begging a Mughal emperor for the tax rights to 38 tiny villages to inadvertently running an entire empire, all because they couldn't stop expanding the balance sheet. The next time you see a jagged line trending upward on a corporate earnings chart, just remember,
Right.
you might not be looking at a simple accounting update. You might be looking at the quiet bureaucratic birth of the next empire.